Hi everyone, and welcome to the 1-800-RESPECT webinar series. Today's topic is exploring practical ways of helping women and children who have experienced domestic and family violence to stay safely in their home. 1-800-RESPECT is pleased to welcome your presenter, Dr Angela Spinney from Swinburne University of Technology. Dr Angela Spinney is a housing academic and lecturer and convenes the Graduate Certificate and Graduate Diploma in Social Science, Housing Management and Policy at the Swinburne Institute for Research in Melbourne. She has an experienced academic on homelessness and its prevention, the marginally housed, affordable housing and the housing consequences of domestic and family violence. In the UK, Angela has worked as Senior Manager of Social Housing, a local authority homelessness department, and has headed the local authority housing policy and research role. This webinar is live and interactive. You are encouraged to participate by posing questions to the presenter. Please note that case-specific information cannot be answered during this webinar. All other questions can be typed into the chat box, which is located at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Responses to your questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. After the session, you will be directed to an online survey, which can help us to improve the running of our future webinars for you. We also encourage you to participate in the online discussion tool, which you will be redirected to after completing the survey. We will be closing this thread at 2:15 p.m, so jump on if you have any further questions that we may not have time for during the next 45 minutes. I'd now like to pass you over to Angela to begin today's presentation.
Oh, hello everyone. Thank you very much for coming in today and listening to me talk. What I'm going to be talking about is exploring some of the practical ways of helping women and children who've experienced domestic and family violence to stay safely in their home. So there are lots of kind of national policy issues, etc., about this, about the way that legislation should be changed both in the states and via the Commonwealth. But really what I want to talk today, or what I want to centre my talk on, is really some of the practical ways that organisations and professionals working in the field can help to assist women and children to stay in their home. So looking at the kind of format of what I'm going to be talking about, first of all, I'm just going to briefly talk about what domestic and family violence encompasses, and in particular why it leads to women and children becoming homeless. That's the focus of today's talk, and I'm coming to you as a housing academic rather than a domestic and family violence academic. We're looking at the interrelated approaches, the things that need to work together to help prevent women and children lose their homes, and as I said before, kind of stressing on the practical strategies that can assist women. And then just very briefly towards the end, we'll be looking at some of the implications for national policy and coming to some conclusions. And I look forward to answering some of your questions later on when I've finished the verbal presentation. Okay, well, if we start off by coming to an agreement about our definition of domestic and family violence, the one that I really like is this one by Cunningham and Baker that was written in 2004. And they said that they defined domestic and family violence as a pattern of coercive behaviour used to maintain control over a partner through a combination of physical, emotional, sexual or financial abuse, enforced social isolation and intimidation. And although now we may add things like spiritual abuse to that, I think it's a good overall cover of what we're actually talking about. As you all know, being practitioners in the field, domestic and family violence can occur and does indeed occur in all cultures, races and religions. It's found in all our communities and across all demographics. And what I mean by that is that absolutely everybody is affected by domestic and family violence. We all know someone who's been affected by it. And demographic means all types of the population, all ages, all socio-economic groups, etc. As we've just talked about in the definition, it's made up of many controlling behaviours. But particularly important for what I want to talk about today is that often these behaviours can be stopped by the relationship coming to an end and by having a strong judicial system that removes the perpetrator from the family home and prevents him from returning. In these situations, the abuse can be brought to an end without women and children having to leave their home. But what I want to stress here is the thing that really makes this work, in fact, the only thing that you could say perhaps that makes this work, is that it has to be the woman's choice, whether she stays in her home or chooses to leave. She's the expert in her situation, and it's her life. And none of these schemes work if there's any kind of pressurizing women to remain in their home. It's all about giving women the choice to stay in the family home if that's what they choose to do. Right, we're now going to come to our first poll, so if we could put those questions up, please. Okay, my poll question for you are, what do you think are some of the most important factors in bringing domestic and family violence to an end without women and children having to move away? And I'm asking you just to choose what you think is the most correct answer. So there's attitude of neighbours to the perpetrator, a strong judicial system that removes the perpetrator and prevents him from returning, and the perpetrator agreeing to leave the family home. Okay, well, your votes are coming in. I can see around about, well, over 80% of you agree with me that it's a strong judicial system that removes the perpetrator and prevents him from returning. Although staying home, leaving violence, etc. schemes can work without court intervention, without injunctions, etc., really, it's the strong judicial system that nationally kind of gives the picture to the perpetrator that domestic and family violence is not acceptable, and also gives women and the rest of society the message that this behaviour is going to be criminalised, this behaviour is wrong. So actually, I think it is a strong judicial system. I agree with those people who've put that. Of course, if the perpetrator voluntarily agrees to leave the family home, as about 10% of you have said, that can help. But really, we want to give the message as a society that we are going to remove the perpetrator if we feel that he has acted criminally. Okay, so if we can close that, please. Thank you. We'll go on to our next section. Well done, everyone. Thank you very much. Now, unfortunately, in our society, there is a real connection between experiencing the crime of domestic and family violence and becoming homeless. And when you think about it, that's actually a really weird thing to happen, because we're talking about women and children who have homes. These are people who primarily were not homeless before they experienced the crime of domestic and family violence. But what we know is that it's currently the major reason for women seeking assistance from homelessness support services in Australia. And that's a pretty big thing to say, isn't it? It's the major reason for women seeking assistance. That's an incredible thing to say. What's more, about approximately half of them are turned away from crisis accommodation services. They're not able to obtain immediate accommodation because there isn't sufficient accommodation for all of them. That means an awful lot of people are either having to return to their perpetrator, or they're having to stay with family and friends, or indeed I've met many women and children who've been living in their car to keep away from their perpetrator. Many of these women do have children. We know that it's the fertile years, the years really between 25 to 45, that we see a spike in being the victim of the criminal behaviour of domestic and family violence, although of course it can happen at any age, and indeed does so. Now, this link has been there for a very long time. Women have always had to flee their home, but over the last decade or so, we've seen a kind of a change, really, a change in attitudes that originated particularly in the UK, but really the last decade or so has come to Australia as well, where we're beginning to see a kind of growing discourse that's saying, well, actually, why is it that women who have homes are having to leave them because of violent and criminal behaviour that they've received in that home? So we're beginning to think about ways around that. And these are important issues because women are much more vulnerable to homelessness than men anyway, because of our economic position. Women earn quite a lot less money than men. We think it's still about between 15 to 17% than men. And of course, we tend to have be more vulnerable in our earning capacity because we often have the care of children as well to look after. There is no doubt that gender has been and remains an important factor in determining the housing options and choices that are made, because our gender affects how well off we are in Australia, and how well off you are in Australia really impacts on what tenure of housing and where that housing is and what kind of housing you can get. We've seen a real feminisation of poverty in Australia, and that's really linked to a changing face of homelessness. We used to think of homelessness in Australia as being all about perhaps single men with alcohol problems was perhaps the stereotypical view. But actually, as I said just now, it's the single largest reason is domestic and family violence. Now, there's been some acknowledgement of that at a national level, and the white paper, The Road Home, published by the Commonwealth at the end of 2008, acknowledged that domestic and family violence continues to be the major driver of homelessness, and that escaping violence is the most common reason provided by people who seek help from specialist homelessness services. So 22% of all people who go to specialist homelessness services for help, and 55% of women with children. But also we know that many women and children don't approach services for help at all. Either they feel it's not for them, or they just think that they're not going to be able to receive any help. They know that people are more often than not turned away because of demand for services. People often ask me, oh, why do women return to their perpetrator? Why is it that women go back? They think it's mad, they think it's crazy. They don't understand that there are many, many reasons why people might go back to their perpetrator. And in fact, in terms of what we're talking about today, one of those very important reasons is going to be that they have nowhere else to go. Taking your child by the hand and walking out, stepping out of your home and into homelessness is such a big decision to do. It's an amazingly hard decision to do. And is it any wonder that women who do that and then find that they have nowhere to go may end up repartnering with their perpetrator? As I put up here on the screen, there are many, many reasons why women want to do it. Ending a relationship for any reason is a complicated business. But when you're faced with the fact that you are going to be homeless if you step away, then it makes it an extremely difficult thing to do. And we have to remember that in terms of enabling women and children to be able to keep their homes. One of the very good reasons for doing it is that women don't feel that they have to return to their perpetrator when they otherwise wouldn't have chosen to do so. Okay, we're going to look now at, excuse me while I got some water. We're going to look now at some interrelated approaches to homelessness prevention. I'm going to start now to think about what are some of the things that we can do. And I did quite a lot of research a year or two ago and looked at the services that are running across Australia and how they combine things and what works really well. And it's when we have that legal system, as we talked about in the earlier poll question, when we remove the perpetrator, when we support women to stay in their home, but we also provide support to women, ongoing support, not just for 6 weeks, but perhaps for 2 years or even longer, support and confidence building in order to enable them to stay at their home. But also, we provide them with provisions such as security devices, confidence building devices, etc., that will help them to remain in their homes. So housing, legal and support have all got to work together in order for us to give the message that actually it's the perpetrator who's going to move, and it's the women who are going to choose, if they choose to do so, will stay safely in their home. So what kind of interventions are we going to look at? Well, as I say, the focus of my talk today is not about changes in legislation or changes in national policy, perhaps. I'm going to look at some examples I found in my research, which were community interventions, aims to alter society's attitude to domestic violence or to men's willingness to seek help for their controlling behaviours. And household and family interventions, things like aims to reduce poverty or to support women to remain in their home. And individual interventions, things like aiming to build women's self-confidence or financial capability that may have been removed from them by going through a domestic and family violence experience. And the things I'm going to talk about are schemes that have been set up without having to resort to changes in national policy, etc. So they are things that organisations can choose to set up for themselves, and that's why I've mostly chosen to talk about them today. And the first one I want to talk about is about social marketing, about when we try and really change that discourse of what is acceptable in our society and what isn't. And I went to BEHAVIOUR Staying Home Leaving Violence scheme, which is the first Staying Home Leaving Violence scheme that was set up in New South Wales several years ago now. But what really impressed me about it was, as well as doing all the work that they're doing in target hardening the homes, making women feel safer in their home, they're also doing lots and lots of social marketing and trying to change the discourse of society. So you'll drive into BEHAVIOUR and there'll be great big banners across the road, for instance, actually saying, "Say no to violence." So that you go into a pub and you'll close the door of the women's toilet and there'll be a big poster saying, "You don't have to accept domestic violence in your home." Lots and lots of advertising in the local cinemas, etc. Lots of campaigning going on. And this really struck me as something that that all organisations can do to some extent and really play a part in doing that. So this is an advertising example that I've put up here. It's a Staying Home Leaving Violence poster from BEHAVIOUR. Very direct. Whoever you are, you have the right to live safely in your own home. So being very specific about the housing issue, not saying you have the right, not to experience domestic violence, etc., but saying you have the right to live safely in your own home, giving the message that you don't have to leave if that's what if you don't want to. And as I say, I think this is something that we could all play a part in doing. I also, in the UK, looked at the Strength to Change social marketing intervention. Now, this is a men's behaviour change program, but it's absolutely underpinned by a marketing campaign. It's therapeutic intervention, access through a helpline, but all the men who access that helpline are not referred. They do it themselves. They choose to do it. So the whole scheme is designed to encourage men to voluntarily decide that they want to change their behaviour, although the primary goal of the scheme is the safety of women and children. And everywhere, this is based in the city of Hull, in the north of the UK, there are beer mats along all the pub counters, posters in men's toilets, on buses, etc. And these are the kind of things they say. I put a poster up here. So this is the Strength to Change, one of the Strength to Change posters. They have them with children as well. But saying, do you scare yourself sometimes? Find the strength to stop domestic violence. So again, it's all centred on that social marketing campaign. It's all centred on the fact that changing the discourse, getting people to think about their behaviour and the behaviour of others. Okay, another family intervention this time that I'd like to talk to you about that I was very impressed about was the BSAFE personal emergency alarms, which was a scheme that was set up in the north of Victoria and had project funding for 3 years, and unfortunately that funding wasn't continued, so it's no longer running. But it was a scheme aimed to encourage women and children to be able to stay in their homes after the perpetrator had been removed by providing them with emergency alarms, which are very much like the ones used for the elderly to allow them to stay safely in their homes. Both landlines and actually mobile phone systems as well. And in fact, people found the mobile phone systems were fantastic because they could use them outside of the house. Particularly children were able to, I heard experiences of children who were able to go travel to school on their own without the risk of being taken away by the perpetrator. They felt much confidence having the BSAFE personal phone with them so that they could call for help if they needed to. So what they found actually with BSAFE was that 70% of the clients who were using it were able to remain in their own home once the alarms had been installed. And a further 20% chose to move out of their house, but were able to stay in their local community where all their support networks were, where the children went to school, doctors, kinders, etc., etc. So what BSAFE was doing was allowing women to have far more choice. It made them feel confident about leaving home. And in fact, that confidence issue is an issue that I really want to stress, because we really want to make women feel confident about staying at home, not only physically be safe by means of changing legislation, really criminalising the perpetrator, etc., but actually giving women whose self-confidence has been eroded, actually giving them the confidence to remain in their home, as I said before, by such things as long-term support, perhaps, but also by just the confidence, in this case by BSAFE, of having a device with them that they know they can call for emergency help as soon as they need it. And there were times that the BSAFE alarms were used, and in fact there was one instance where the operator actually came on the line and warned the perpetrator off, told him that he was being recorded, and that managed to stop an extremely potentially dangerous incident from occurring. Okay, so interventions to prevent multiple experiences of homelessness then, really I think when we look at individual ones, we need to acknowledge women's strengths, of the strengths that women already have, of what they've already been through, and of what they will continue to do in their future successful life of living independently without the perpetrator. One of the ways of doing that is by improving financial capability. And also a scheme I want to tell you about providing early intervention for children. So the examples I'd like to talk about here when we're talking about individual interventions that we can perhaps use is a scheme called Tools for Change in Victoria. The children's scheme that I want to tell you about is one that I've been heavily involved in myself, called Safe from the Start. And I also want to tell you about some of the work that Hobart's Women's Shelter is doing in Tasmania, where they're really looking to try and replicate all that peer empathy and working together that we so fantastically happened in the refuges. They're trying to replicate that out of a refuge situation when women stay in their own home, because one of the, if you like, disadvantages of women staying at home is they may not know any people to actually buddy up with to help them in the same situation. But organisations are looking at ways around that. So first of all, telling you about the Tools for Change Financial Capability Project. This was designed to, again in Victoria, helps women to regain financial confidence and capability, and so reduces financial reliance on perpetrators. And this is really important, because if we think back to what what we define domestic and family violence is, if the perpetrator is trying to have power and control over his victim, then we absolutely need to regain that power for the women, and financial capability is one of the ways to do that. And how Tools for Change did that was by providing volunteers who would be financial mentors for women exiting violent relationships who had low financial confidence. So the mentors helped things with explaining bills, setting up direct debit bank payments, dealing with credit card debts, helping in some cases to declare bankruptcy, and generally with distangling the finances from those of the ex-partner. And of course these are really important issues for women staying in their own home who are going to become fully independent, perhaps take on the tenancy or sole owner occupation of that home and the responsibility for it. Okay, I'm going to take another glug of water now, excuse me. Okay, Hobart's Women's Shelter. Now, they really impressed me because they run programs for residents of the refuge, of their own accommodation, and for people who are living in their dispersed accommodation as well, but also for women who remain in their own homes. So they haven't created a divide. They've opened up some schemes, for example, KISS, which is called Keeping Yourself Safe and Sane, which is a weekly education and peer support group for women who are experiencing or have experienced domestic or family violence. So as I say, what I was explaining just now, what they've done there is that they've tried to replicate some of the peer support that was so fantastic from the refuge movement to women who are actually choosing to remain in their own home. Because social isolation is really one of the strong things that we need to combat if we're really going to help enable women who choose to do so to remain at home. So KISS is one of the ways they've done that. They also have a scheme called WISP, which is the Women's Integrated Support Pilot Project, which provides one-on-one support and advocacy, so rather than the group work of keeping yourself safe and sane. They also run some work on family literacy, and again, and mother and child support groups. And again, that's regardless of whether women are choosing to remain in their own home and not enter Hobart Women's Shelter accommodation. And I think as time goes on, we'll see that divide, we'll see blur, we'll see a grey line, and I think that's a really good thing, indeed. What I put up on your screen now is some materials from Safe from the Start, which is a Salvation Army Tasmania scheme to help children who've experienced domestic and family violence and the subsequent homelessness that's come with that, come to terms with their experiences. Because more and more research is showing that, it's not least said, soon as mended. We need to create a situation in which we enable children to talk about their experiences if they wish to do so. And that in turn helps mothers also with their parenting and with rebuilding their lives, whether it's remaining in their own home or not. Okay, if we could come to our second poll question now, please. Okay, this is a bit of a recap on something that we were talking about earlier. Okay, so the question is, what three service systems need to work effectively together to keep women safely living in their homes once the violent relationship is over? Oh, and fantastic. Good to hear. Good to see that you were listening. That's right. So it's housing services, support services, and legal services. Refugees do absolutely fantastic work, and they will continue to be needed because it's not always going to be possible, and women are not always going to choose to remain in their own home. But when we're talking about women staying home, we're talking about them not accessing homelessness services. We're actually talking about them not becoming homeless. So you've overwhelmingly answered that at 96% in the way that I would agree with. Although, as I say, none of those questions are totally wrong. Right, so if we can take that poll off, please. Thank you very much indeed. Excellent. Okay, so we've talked a lot about ways, as I say, which I think organisations could perhaps implement some of those things without resorting to national policy initiatives and things. But just before I finish, I want to talk very briefly about some of the things that would really help nationally, because there are things that we need to do as a nation at a federal and Commonwealth level, as well as things that individual organisations can do. And the first of those is legislation, injunctions, orders and breaches, the roles of the court and police and legal. Because you know what, there's an incredible discrepancy about the way that the states both legislate and deal with injunctions and breaches, etc., and the way that the police do that and the courts as well. And we need to make that much more of a uniform system. It shouldn't be a postcode lottery about what kind of service women receive. So nationally, we need to do something about that. We also need to make sure that we introduce a system where there's long-term welfare and support, as well as physical security for women and children who seek to remain in their home. 6 weeks isn't going to cut it for some of these women. They're going to need a lot more support. It may not be very much. It might be a phone call once a week, etc. But they need to know that they can tap into someone if they need it. And if we're going to go to the much cheaper form of homelessness prevention, the work we've been talking about today is much, much cheaper than providing refuges, then we can jolly well find some money as a nation to actually provide that long-term welfare and support. It would also really help if we had national sharing of information between accredited agencies, because we don't have that at the moment, and it's a disadvantage to professionals who work in the field. And we need financial mortgage assistance. In the way that we have Commonwealth rental assistance, we need mortgage assistance for owner-occupiers who choose to stay in their home with the perpetrator removed. It's just not on, really, that owner-occupiers are actually disadvantaged in this situation. We need to find a way of helping women and children to remain in their homes regardless of what tenure their house in. It should be irrelevant. So just briefly looking at the practice implications, as I said before, we need to provide practical and emotional support. Both these things are really important. I found that the provision of emergency alarm systems seemed to be one of the really good ways of doing that. Peer support provision in a way that's in a non-refuge setting, in the way that Hobart's Women's Shelter have, was really good. Personal development and financial confidence training seem to be a real advantage as well. And social marketing. Social marketing directed at both the perpetrator and at society in general are really practical ways that we can start to give a message out that we support women in this situation. We don't expect them to become homeless because they've experienced a crime. My final conclusions is that integrated homelessness prevention schemes can and will increasingly do so play an important role in preventing homelessness. And we know now that that's true for women living in very different situations, in very different geographical areas and types of housing. And we also know that there is no evidence at all that women who stay at home with integrated support are more at risk than if they had left their home. But what I can't stress enough is that if those women have the choice whether they choose to stay, we should never force women to stay. Thank you very much for listening to me today. I really appreciate it. Do contact me for information. I put some references up there, so if you want to know where those come from, just email me on that following address. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Angela, for that great presentation. I think our audience have definitely heard some great strategies to help women and children to stay in their homes. So we're now going to open up for a few questions for Angela to answer. So if you would like to ask a question, please do so by typing the questions into the chat box at the bottom left of your screen. Now, we have had a couple of questions come through for you, Angela. So our first question comes from Mark, and Mark's question is, housing wealth in Australia is an important buffer to poverty, especially in old age. What are the ramifications for women who lose their housing wealth through domestic and family violence?
Well, Mark is absolutely right. There is that we do have a real problem with ageing women at the moment, and the fact that women tend to have much less super than men. So if we don't come with a buffer of housing wealth, if we don't come with owner occupation with no mortgage into retirement, then we have a real problem, because what we know is that social housing, public and community housing, is extremely difficult to access, enormous waiting lists, and that private rented costs that are way in excess often of the amount that women can claim for Commonwealth rental assistance. So if women are going to retirement with either large mortgages or with private rent to pay, particularly for us as women, because we have less super, it is a real problem. And I would advise any woman who, whether they stay or leave the family home following domestic and family violence, that they get good legal support absolutely as soon as they can about what their rights are, about the housing wealth that's within the family unit. Too often women are losing out. They're becoming homeless and losing out on that housing wealth. And one of the things that we should be doing as a nation is providing free legal support and help to those women, so that we make sure that they're not disadvantaged.
That's great, thank you. Now we have had one more question from Malia, and the question is, I'm wondering what the evidence of behavioural change in Bega and or Hull was as a result of the programs. For example, was their baseline data able to be evaluated using things like police call-outs, repeat call-outs, IVOs, hospital emergency department data, and population surveys?
Okay, well, I know for Hull, for strength of change, there has been a cost-benefit analysis done, and that did look at things like police call-outs, hospitalisations, etc. And that is available, I believe, it certainly was last time I looked, which was only a couple of months ago. That's available by free on the internet. So if Malia would like to Google or whatever, strength of change and then cost-benefit analysis, she should get those reports available to her, okay.
Okay, that's great. And we have had a second question come through from Malia. So are police an important part of the solution to keeping women in the home?
Okay, well, yes and no really is what I'd say to that. The reason I'm saying no is because we know that most women who experience domestic and family violence never contact the police. So most people in this situation, the police are not involved. But where the police are involved, it's really important that they do their job well. And there are discrepancies between areas in the way that police deal first with initial call-outs and deal with breaches of interventions, etc., later on. So we need to get that right. We need to get police training right, and we need their supervisors to prioritise domestic and family violence work. Having said that, things have really, really improved over the last 10 to 15 years, but we're not there yet. We're not in a perfect situation. But I say that with, as I say, with the knowledge that most domestic and family violence situations, the police are not involved at all.
That's great. Now, we have just had a comment come through from Lee, and she said that there are some excellent ideas in here. Now, Lee does have a question, and the question is, where do you see the funding to services to build this capacity coming from?
Okay, well, that's a very good question. And what I would say is that we've spent an awful lot of money on refuges and the provision of enabling women to leave their perpetrator and to leave their home. Over the last 40 or so years, we've spent an awful lot of money doing that. And that was right for its time. I'm not dishing refugees at all. They've done a fantastic job, and we will always continue to need some form of crisis accommodation. It's not always the right thing for women to stay in the family home. But the money that we've spent on that, we could be spending some of that money on homelessness prevention. We could be spending some of that on enabling women and children to stay in their homes. Now, in the UK, where homelessness prevention for women and children has become mainstream, funding has come because there's legislation that women and children who have experienced domestic and family violence have to be picked up by the homelessness system, have to be housed. Now, the situation in Australia is different. There is no right to housing. We don't, as I've said earlier on in the presentation, we turn a lot of women away from who try and enter crisis accommodation. There's no legal sanction that women and children have to be housed. So for us, it's a bit more tricky, but I'm thinking that we can direct some of the money away. And that's what we're saying. These schemes are widespread now in, there's about 21, 22 schemes in New South Wales. And there are schemes in most other states as well. So we're getting there, but we're just not there yet. We need to really have an equality of homelessness prevention and refuge kind of funding.
Okay, that's great. And we've had another question come through from Maria. So Maria's question is, do you think that domestic violence will be more difficult to address in the near future in the context of the Australian housing market?
I think the housing consequences of domestic and family violence are definitely becoming more difficult, absolutely, because, to be honest, it's difficult for any of us to get housed at the moment, and relationship breakdown, for whatever reason, causes housing strife. We tend to need now 2 incomes in order to support our housing. We have the least affordable housing in the world compared to our incomes. In Australia, we've actually got ourselves into a situation where our housing is really, really unaffordable. And as I say, relationship breakdown for any reason, but definitely including domestic and family violence, disadvantages those affected.
Fantastic. Thank you, Angela. So just as a reminder to everybody, if you do have any questions for Angela to answer, please do type them into the chat box at the bottom left-hand side of your screen. Okay, we have had another question come through from Lee. So the question is, do you see that different approaches are needed in metropolitan areas and regional, rural and remote areas?
Well, that's again, a very interesting question, because you would suppose it would. Before I started my research, I thought that it would be much more difficult in remote and regional areas because it would take much longer for emergency services, the police, etc., to come out if a perpetrator had come back to a house that women and children had chosen to remain in, for instance. But actually, when my research was all about going out and asking organisations what they'd found rather than asking the women themselves. But what came back to me over and over again was that these schemes can work just as effectively in rural and remote areas. And that actually really surprised me. But it came back to two issues. The first one was that, as I said before, police are very often not involved in domestic and family violence situations anyway. And secondly, that women have had to, they choose to stay. Women are experts in their own situation. So the women that choose to stay do so knowing that one, that they think in their situation that one, their house can be made safe, that they have the confidence to stay, and also that they know their perpetrator. And what came back to me over and over again is that these perpetrators are often bullies. But if they're treated, you know, like sternly enough, if you like, if we as a society back up the woman's ability to stay in their home and justify that and applaud it, then actually the bullies will be cowed from staying away. But that, of course, is not always the case, and that's why women absolutely have to have the choice.
Okay, that's great. So we've probably got time for one more question. Now, Pratisha has asked, have you heard of any programs around the globe as part of behaviour change, engaging men and boys to end domestic and family violence? And did the program work out? And do you have any references where we can refer to? Okay, thank you,
Hey,
Angela.
everyone, I'm back online now.
We are back online. Now, we do have one last question there. The question posed is, have you heard of any programs around the globe as part of behaviour change, engaging men and boys to end domestic and family violence? And did the program work out? Do you have any references where we can refer to?
Well, the one I talked about in the presentation, Strength to Change, I would recommend, and there is quite a lot of available information on the internet. But also I know that there's a really good scheme, I can't remember the name of it, in WA, and in fact the UK scheme, Strength to Change, actually took its model from the WA one. So yeah, do some investigation on that, and I'm so sorry that I can't remember the name of it at the moment.
Okay, that's great. Thank you so much, Angela. Thank you for answering all of those questions. Now, we are just about out of time, so we are going to have to end today's session here. Please do stay logged in to take our short online survey, and at the end of the survey you'll be provided with a link to our discussion forum where you can discuss comments. Now, I'll just let everybody know that the next webinar in this series is on technology, stalking and domestic violence, and the webinar will be presented by Dr Delaney Woodlock on Wednesday the 21st of May. Now, on behalf of the entire 1-800-RESPECT team, I thank you for attending this webinar and hope that you have found it valuable. Please stay online now to take our quick survey. Thank you, everyone.